The solemn reading and the shocking revelation. The rain outside the ornate mahogany-paneled room was a dreary soundtrack to the tension inside. It was a weather fitting for the occasion, the reading of Elias Vance's last will and testament. Elias, my grandfather, had been the patriarch of the family and the founder of Vance Industries, a sprawling, if somewhat antiquated, textile empire. His death 6 weeks ago had left a vacuum that was now being awkwardly filled by the uncomfortable silence and the rustling of legal papers. The setting was the small library of the Vance Manor, a room smelling perpetually of old leather, pipe smoke, and fading glory. 9 of us were present. My Aunt Clara, weeping dramatically into an expensive lace handkerchief. Cousin Marcus, whose only discernible talent was borrowing money. And then there were the 3 figures around whom the true gravity of the meeting revolved. The lawyer, myself, and my sister. Mr. Alastair Finch, the family solicitor for 40 years, adjusted his spectacles, his movements slow and deliberate, enhancing the gravitas of the moment. He was a man built like a reliable filing cabinet, entirely necessary but deeply uninteresting. "If we may begin," he announced, his voice thin but cutting through the silence easily. I, the narrator, let's call me Alex, sat quietly near the back. I was the family's resident underachiever, the quiet one who had chosen a path in freelance design over corporate takeover. I had loved my grandfather deeply, spending hours with him discussing history and art, interests the rest of the family deemed trivial compared to quarterly profits. I expected a modest sum, perhaps the library's antique globe, or a few $1,000s, a symbolic gesture of remembrance. Then there was my sister, Captain Victoria Vance. Victoria sat directly across the room from me, radiating a rigid, almost military certainty. She was the family's pride and joy, the embodiment of the Vance work ethic applied to a much grander stage. Victoria had foregone the textile empire for the armed forces, rising quickly through the ranks, adorned with medals and commendations for service overseas. She had just completed a particularly high-profile tour and was home on leave, looking every bit the disciplined, indomitable hero in her sharply tailored civilian clothes. She was the one who deserved it in the family's eyes. She was the one who had defended the family name on the world stage, who had sacrificed and served. The reading began with the minor bequests, jewelry to Aunt Clara, a parcel of non-productive land to Cousin Marcus, much to Marcus's visible dismay. Mr. Finch then moved on to the major assets. To Captain Victoria Vance, the lawyer read, his tone becoming marginally more formal, "My beloved granddaughter, in recognition of her distinguished service and sacrifice for her country, I bequeath the sum of $2 million and the controlling interest in the South American division of Vance Textiles, along with the family's collection of Renaissance firearms." A collective, approving sigh swept through the room. Victoria's face remained a mask of professional satisfaction. $2 million was a generous starting point, but the South American division was substantial. This was the expected lion's share, the hero's reward. Mr. Finch paused, taking a slow sip of water. The air was heavy with anticipation, but the main act, in everyone's mind, was already done. What remained were scraps. It was at this moment, before the lawyer could continue with the rest of the division of assets, that Victoria broke the decorum. She stood up. It wasn't a casual rising. It was the kind of stand that demanded attention, executed with the practiced posture of a seasoned officer addressing a subordinate. Her eyes, sharp and unwavering, swept across the room and landed directly on the lawyer. "Mr. Finch," her voice was clear, resonant, and utterly uncompromising. "With all due respect to the will's initial sentiments, I believe there is an error in allocation." The lawyer looked up, one eyebrow arching slightly above the frame of his spectacles. The rest of the family shifted uncomfortably. Aunt Clara stopped weeping. Victoria pressed on, her hands braced on the table. She spoke not just with conviction, but with what sounded like absolute legal and moral certitude. "My service has not been confined to simple duty. It has been constant, life-risking dedication. I have brought unparalleled honor to the Vance name. I handled the press after the company's PR disaster last year, even while deployed. I am the only one equipped with the discipline and strategic foresight to manage this entire company. to honor grandfather's legacy properly. Frankly, she declared, her eyes now flashing with an icy resolve that made me shiver, I believe, and the entire family here can attest, I deserve it all. The entire inheritance, the whole of Vance Industries. The silence that followed her audacious claim was deafening. It was a shocking, brazen demand, delivered with the absolute conviction that her entitlement was unquestionable. My cousin Marcus sputtered. Aunt Clara looked torn between horror and admiration for the sheer nerve of it. I felt a familiar sting of inferiority. Compared to her medals, my quiet life looked like an act of selfishness. She had served a country. I had merely served myself. Victoria stared down Mr. Finch, expecting immediate capitulation or, at least, a respectful acknowledgement of her superior status. Mr. Finch, however, remained utterly unperturbed. He slowly lowered his water glass, his gaze steady. The dramatic tension in the room coiled tighter than a spring. He reached for the document, tapping the last page with a well-manicured finger. He ignored Victoria completely, as if her entire declaration was merely a fly buzzing in the room. Indeed, Captain Vance, the lawyer said, his voice flat. Your grandfather was certainly aware of your outstanding service. He cleared his throat, pushing the heavy will slightly aside. He picked up a separate, smaller parchment, a codicil that none of us had seen before. Then, with a devastating, professional finality that shattered Victoria's moment of triumph, the lawyer did not look at her, did not look at the company or the firearms. He looked directly at me, and the lawyer, Mr. Finch, pointed one slow, deliberate finger across the polished table, directly at Alex. ##, the audacious claim of the military sister. Captain Victoria Vance stood tall, a monument to discipline and achievement, eclipsing the stunned silence that followed her declaration. The mahogany-paneled library, which had always symbolized quiet, inherited wealth, now felt like a cramped courthouse awaiting a decisive verdict. Her posture, the subtle flex of her shoulders beneath the expensive fabric of her blazer, spoke volumes about her training and her absolute lack of doubt. She was not asking. She was issuing an executive order based on a lifetime of service. I am serious, Mr. Finch, she reiterated, her voice cutting through the stifling air. My grandfather entrusted me with significant assets, and I appreciate the $2 million and the South American division. However, you must realize that dividing the core company, Vance Industries, among multiple, less experienced parties is a financial risk Elias would never have tolerated. Cousin Marcus, attempting to regain some dignity after the initial shock, weakly interjected, Vicky, the rest of us are family too. We've been involved in the company. Victoria shot him a look so cold and calibrated it could have been delivered over a secure satellite link. You, Marcus, have been involved in the payroll for 20 years, mostly through a sinecure. When the Venezuelan government threatened sanctions on our largest textile export line, who flew out, leveraged contacts in the State Department, and stabilized the contract. Not a single person in this room, save for me, possesses the geopolitical understanding to run a modern international corporation. Her logic was brutally effective and hard to argue against. She wasn't just relying on sentiment. She was presenting a case study of her indispensability. She then turned her attention to me, Alex, still seated near the back, feeling increasingly small and civilian. Her gaze was not malicious, but pitying, far worse than anger. Alex, she said, using the familial tone that made her judgment sting even more, I love you, but your chosen career, designing websites and logos, is simply not scalable to managing a multi-million-dollar manufacturing entity. You need stability, yes, but Vance Industries needs leadership. Grandfather knew the difference between a legacy and a hobby. She painted a clear picture of sacrifice versus comfort. She had spent tours in dangerous, austere environments, missing holidays and family gatherings, dedicating her life to a cause larger than herself and, by extension, bringing immense prestige to the Vance name. I, conversely, had spent those same years in a cozy apartment, chasing freelance contracts and enjoying the relative ease of creative work. I am the only Vance whose name is regularly in national news for reasons other than quarterly profits, she continued, her voice gaining a missionary zeal. My service is my sacrifice. Every medal I wear, every promotion I earned, was a testament to the discipline grandfather instilled in us. I protected the family's honor on the world stage. I earned the right to guide this company into the future. Her climax was powerful. Therefore, Mr. Finch, I formally request that the remainder of the estate, including the controlling shares of the parent company, the manor, and all residual financial instruments, be consolidated under my stewardship. It is the only sensible, secure, and deserved outcome. I am claiming it all. The room collectively held its breath. She had thrown down the gauntlet. She had leveraged her heroism, her military discipline, and her sheer force of will against the quiet, unspoken wishes of the deceased, attempting to supersede the written word with the overwhelming weight of her perceived merit. Mr. Finch, the lawyer, finally offered a response, yet it was not addressed to Victoria. He slowly picked up the heavy, leather-bound copy of the will again, not looking at her, but instead running a thin finger down the margin of a page near the end. Captain Vance, the lawyer said, his voice flat, emotionless, and precisely calibrated. Your statement regarding your distinguished service is noted and is certainly commendable. He then looked up, finally meeting her eyes, and there was a flicker in his own, not of admiration, but of profound, weary knowledge. However, he continued, placing the heavy manual down with a soft thud that somehow sounded like a death knell to her argument. My duty is not to evaluate the commendable nature of your service, but to execute the explicit, final, and unwavering intentions of the late Mr. Vance. He did not argue her claim. He simply dismissed its relevance to the legal matter at hand. The room was tense, expecting a legal lecture. Instead, Mr. Finch pushed the large will aside and picked up the single, smaller sheet of parchment, the codicil, he had earlier retrieved from a separate envelope. He held it up, a pale, almost fragile contrast to the main document. Mr. Vance, knowing the potential for spirited debate among his inheritors, added this final codicil 2 weeks before his passing. It explicitly modifies the disposition of the remaining 51% of Vance Industries' controlling shares, the contents of this manor, and the residual liquid assets. Victoria's confidence wavered for the first time. Her expression changed from one of absolute command to sharp, alert suspicion. Mr. Finch cleared his throat one last time, ignoring the palpable anxiety in the room. He did not read the codicil immediately. Instead, he made his move, the gesture that would forever define the drama of that rain-swept afternoon. He slowly, deliberately raised his hand, pointing across the wide expanse of the mahogany table, past the polished silver tea service, past the stunned face of Captain Victoria Vance. And with a precision honed by 4 decades of delivering crushing news, he pointed directly at me. Alex. ##, the lawyer's intervention and the hidden clause. The sight of Mr. Finch's finger, steady and unwavering, pointed directly at me. Alex, the quiet freelance designer, caused a collective gasp that was immediately followed by a furious, indignant silence. Victoria, standing rigid moments before in triumphant certainty, now looked as if she'd been hit by a non-lethal round, stunned, disoriented, and professionally offended. "What is the meaning of this, Mr. Finch?" Victoria demanded, her voice dangerously low, stripped of its earlier bravado and edged with suspicion. The codicil must be read, and it must justify this dramatic spectacle. The rest of the family, Aunt Clara, Marcus, and the others, were a tableau of frozen astonishment, their heads swiveling between the lawyer, the decorated war hero, and me, the quiet observer. They expected an immediate, logical defense of the lawyer's action, an explanation for why the man who deserved the most was being passed over for the person who had asked for nothing. Mr. Finch remained the eye of the hurricane. He finally lowered his hand, his expression entirely neutral, signifying that the drama belonged only to the family, not to the law. "Captain Vance, as I stated, my duty is to execute Mr. Vance's explicit instructions," the lawyer reiterated, his voice regaining its thin, authoritative register. He tapped the small, pale codicil with a fingernail. "This document is an independent, legally witnessed instruction. Your grandfather, Elias Vance, specifically stipulated that this codicil was to be held separate from the main will and read only after the initial bequests were concluded and only after every heir present had been given a formal opportunity to state any objection or concern regarding the preliminary divisions. The subtle implication was that Elias had anticipated Victoria's grand, public display of self-entitlement and had structured the reading precisely to follow it. The silence deepened as everyone realized the setup. Victoria's bold declaration, "I deserve it all," had walked straight into a trap laid by the deceased. Mr. Finch carefully unfolded the parchment. This is a simple amendment, but its impact is comprehensive. It begins with a prefatory note from Mr. Vance himself. The lawyer adjusted his spectacles and began to read from the codicil, the words cutting through the tense air. Asterisk to my family. I leave you with this final thought. True legacy is not built on public recognition or the accumulation of power, but on quiet, unconditional loyalty and the spirit of simple kindness. It is easy to be a hero when the world is watching, but it takes profound character to be good when no one is. Asterisk. Victoria's jaw tightened visibly. Her face flushed a deep crimson as she understood the explicit critique aimed directly at her public-facing heroism. Mr. Finch continued, his tone dry and factual. Asterisk, therefore, regarding the disposition of the remaining 51% of the controlling shares of Vance Industries, the Vance Manor residence, and the entirety of my residual liquid wealth, estimated to be approximately $23 million. I hereby name my grandson, Alex Vance, as the sole and complete beneficiary. Asterisk. The words hung in the air, $23 million and the total controlling interest. The sheer scale of the shift was staggering. The company, the family seat, the power, it all bypassed the recognized hero and landed on the quiet one. Aunt Clara let out a choked sound of disbelief. Cousin Marcus slumped forward, burying his face in his hands, defeated not by his own lack of inheritance, but by the sheer, unexpected triumph of the family's perceived weak link. Victoria's reaction, however, was the most profound. Her face went from red-hot anger to ice-cold disbelief. She took a step back, her military posture momentarily collapsing. "This is impossible," she whispered, shaking her head. "There has to be a mistake, a legal loophole. That division, it completely undermines the company's stability and my capability to lead." She looked at Mr. Finch, then at me. Her expression was now a furious mix of betrayal and calculation. She was already strategizing how to fight the codicil. Mr. Finch remained impassive. "There is no mistake, Captain Vance. The codicil is properly witnessed, signed, and entirely unambiguous. It is the final and prevailing legal instrument." He then looked pointedly at me again, as if to remind the entire room that I was now the central figure, the sudden, unwilling inheritor of a vast fortune and a complex manufacturing empire. "Furthermore," Mr. Finch added, picking up another folded note that had been tucked inside the codicil. Mr. Vance included a personal letter, addressed specifically to Alex, to be read only by Alex after the codicil's provisions were declared. He handed the sealed, heavy paper envelope to me. The shock of the inheritance was one thing. The implication that my grandfather had planned this secret transfer of power for months, possibly years, was another. He had used the public reading, Victoria's arrogant claim, and the dramatic pointing gesture to completely upend the family's assumptions about merit and legacy. The lawyer had executed the grand switch perfectly, transforming the atmosphere from an expected distribution of wealth into a devastating, personal confrontation about who Elias Vance truly valued. The battle for the inheritance had just pivoted entirely onto my quiet shoulders, all thanks to a hidden clause and a final, surprising vote of confidence from a dead man. #, the true motive and the secret legacy. The silence following the lawyer's declaration of the final codicil was thick with disbelief, but the handing of the personal letter, a thick, cream-colored envelope bearing the distinct, elegant script of my grandfather Elias Vance, introduced a new, painful layer of intimacy to the corporate drama. I, Alex, felt the eyes of every person in the room on me. Victoria was still standing, though her stance was now less martial and more simply wounded, her gaze drilling into the envelope in my hands as if trying to decipher its contents through sheer force of will. She needed to know the reason, the hidden calculus that negated her years of highly visible, decorated effort. Mr. Finch, ever the facilitator of uncomfortable truth, spoke again. Alex, your grandfather insisted this letter be read by you, but he made no stipulation regarding privacy. I suggest you read it now. It explains the motive, which, I believe, is essential for all present to understand the depth of his final intentions. With trembling hands, I broke the wax seal, the Vance family crest, and unfolded the heavy paper. The scent of my grandfather's favorite aged pipe tobacco immediately hit me, a nostalgic pang that was strangely grounding amidst the chaos. I began to read the familiar handwriting, my voice initially a whisper, but gaining strength as I absorbed the weight of his words. My dearest Alex, if you are reading this, Mr. Finch has successfully navigated the performance piece I designed for this afternoon. I imagine Victoria has made a spirited, self-assured case for why she, the celebrated hero, deserves everything. She always mistook the spotlight for the substance of merit. Asterisk. Victoria flinched visibly at the unvarnished critique. Asterisk, do not misunderstand me. I am immensely proud of Victoria's service. She chose a difficult path and excelled, earning her respect through tangible acts of courage. That is why she received a substantial, yet segregated, portion of my estate, enough for independence, but not enough for control. Her strength lies in command and defense. She needs a challenge to validate her existence. She would see Vance Industries not as a responsibility, but as another field to conquer. Asterisk. I paused, gathering my breath, feeling the pressure of my sister's intense scrutiny. The letter wasn't just dividing assets. It was defining character. Asterisk, but you, my quiet one, have a different kind of strength. A strength I needed more, especially in my final years. Do you remember 2 years ago, when you quietly canceled your application to the art fellowship in Italy? You never spoke of it, but I knew. You used the next 12 months to manage my household accounts, coordinate my medical care, and simply sit with me for hours while I spoke nonsense. Not because you expected a reward, or because it was glamorous, but because you recognized my vulnerability and chose kindness over ambition. Asterisk. My eyes blurred slightly. No one in the family, not even Victoria, who was always jetting off to the next high-profile assignment, had known about the canceled fellowship, a major sacrifice I had made to ensure my grandfather was not alone as his health deteriorated. It was a mundane, unheroic act of duty. Asterisk. Victoria's sacrifice was public, chosen, and ultimately self-fulfilling. Your sacrifice was private, born silently, and rooted in unconditional love. She fought battles for the nation. You fought the quiet, necessary battles of a man in decline. Asterisk. Asterisk. A corporation, Alex, does not need another commanding officer demanding victory. It needs a steward with a steady hand and a kind heart, someone who can nurture growth rather than merely conquer markets. It needs the quiet loyalty and the gentle insight you showed me. The company is now stable. It doesn't need saving. It needs managing with integrity, something you possess in abundance. Asterisk. Asterisk. I am leaving you the control of the company, not as a reward, but as a foundation for the life you deferred for my sake. Use this security to create the life you truly want. Do not let this burden crush your spirit. Let it free your talent. Be the kind, quiet leader you have always been. The kind, quiet grandson. Asterisk. Asterisk. All my love, Grandfather Elias. Asterisk. I finished reading, the silence returning. This time weighted not with ambition or shock, but with a profound, aching understanding. The true motive wasn't about business acumen or military service. It was about unconditional love and silent sacrifice. The air was stripped bare. Victoria stood exposed. Her public heroism had been weighed against my private devotion and found wanting. She realized that her relentless pursuit of glory and validation had blinded her to what Elias truly valued: the simple, grounding act of caring for a frail man. Victoria's mask finally broke. Her face crumpled, not in anger at the money, but in sudden, devastating shame. She hadn't earned the control because she hadn't given the kind of private, selfless care that truly mattered in the end. The battle she should have fought was at home, not overseas. The revelation was a victory for me, but it felt agonizing. I held the letter, not a will, but a testament to a quiet bond, the real legacy Elias wanted to pass on. The entire room, Aunt Clara, Marcus, even Mr. Finch, now saw the complete picture, understanding that Elias Vance's final act was a profound, strategic endorsement of the unacknowledged goodness in the world. I looked up at Victoria, who could not meet my gaze. She had everything the world valued, but she had failed the final, most important test of her grandfather's heart. Now, as the sole controller of the Vance estate, the immediate task was clear: to manage the fallout of this devastating truth and begin to forge a new path, honoring the quiet confidence Elias had placed in me. ## the aftermath and a new beginning. The raw, silent grief in the library, following the reading of Grandfather Elias's personal letter, was heavier than the fortune itself. Victoria, Captain Vance, the indomitable hero, was visibly shattered. She didn't lash out at Mr. Finch or challenge the legality of the codicil. The letter had disarmed her more completely than any legal maneuver could have. Her defeat was not financial. It was existential. She realized the sacrifices she prized had been seen by the man who mattered most as choices of self-fulfillment, whereas my quiet devotion was seen as true sacrifice. She turned abruptly and, without a word to anyone, walked out of the library, the decisive click of the door echoing her final, defeated exit from the immediate proceedings. Aunt Clara started sobbing again, but this time, the tears seemed genuine, less for the money and more for the painful complexity of Elias's wisdom. Cousin Marcus, surprisingly, merely offered me a weak nod of respect before slinking out. Mr. Finch closed the codicil and the main will, stacking them neatly. "Well, Alex," he said, his voice returning to its calm, professional tone. "The estate is now yours to manage. Congratulations, and perhaps condolences. This is a considerable weight." The considerable weight was an understatement. I was the reluctant inheritor of a massive manufacturing enterprise, a sprawling manor, and a heap of familial resentment, all based on a history of quiet care that only my grandfather had witnessed. ### assuming control and facing hostility. The immediate days following the will reading were a maelstrom of legal briefings, financial reviews, and navigating family hostility. The rest of the Vances, unable to challenge the ironclad will, channeled their resentment toward me. I was the undeserving outsider who had, through a hidden technicality and some sentimental manipulation, as Aunt Clara put it, usurped the control that rightfully belonged to a proven leader. I spent the first month immersing myself in the operations of Vance Industries. My grandfather's faith wasn't entirely blind. He knew I was detail-oriented and possessed a strong sense of ethical fairness. I hired a seasoned CEO to handle the day-to-day corporate warfare, a woman Elias had secretly vetted years ago, and focused my energy on the strategic, long-term vision. I used my design background not to conquer, but to creatively solve the company's entrenched problems, focusing on sustainable practices and ethical sourcing, aligning the business with the quiet principles my grandfather had valued. The company didn't need a dictator. It needed a careful steward. ### the new path and personal freedom. The inheritance fundamentally changed my life, allowing me to finally pursue the artistic ambitions I had put aside. I established the Elias Vance Foundation, dedicating a substantial portion of the residual wealth to funding scholarships for quiet, promising artists who had deferred their dreams due to family obligation or financial need. A direct, living tribute to the sacrifice Elias had acknowledged in his letter. I also took up residence in the Vance Manor, not as a symbol of power, but as a quiet sanctuary where I could continue my design work while managing the estate. The globe from the library, the antique I had originally hoped for, now sat proudly in my new office, a constant reminder that true value often resides in sentiment, not market price. The fortune had provided not just security but freedom, the freedom to be the kind of person Elias wanted me to be. ### the reconciliation, the optional olive branch. Several weeks later, Victoria called. She wasn't at the manor, but at her military base. The call was stiff, professional, and entirely devoid of the previous venom. "Alex," she began, her voice carefully modulated. "I have reviewed the estate documents and spoken with Mr. Finch. The codicil is unassailable. I apologize for my conduct at the reading. It was unbecoming." I could hear the immense effort the apology cost her. "I understand, Victoria. Grandfather set us both up for a hard lesson." "He did," she conceded. "I realize now I was seeking validation from him through visible achievements, and you were simply offering him support. I let my ego overshadow what he needed. I made a difficult choice. I had control. I had the freedom I needed. Holding a grudge was the kind of petty move Elias had implicitly warned against." "Victoria," I said gently, "Grandfather left you $2 million and a key division of the company. That is substantial. I want you to manage the South American division entirely independently, as he intended. But beyond that, I want to offer you a seat on the main Vance Industries board. Not because you demanded it, but because the company does need your strategic mind, especially in risk assessment and global logistics. You don't have the controlling interest, but you will have influence." The line was silent for a long moment. It was an olive branch extended from a position of quiet strength. A move that surprised her more than the inheritance itself. "Why?" she finally asked, suspicion creeping back in. "Because the goal isn't to punish," I explained. "It's to honor his legacy by being a good steward, and that means utilizing the best talent we have. And despite everything, you are still family, and you are still brilliantly strategic. I won't let our personal history damage the company he entrusted to me." Victoria accepted the offer. It was a partnership based not on love or resentment, but on respectful necessity. My new beginning was defined not by the wealth I gained, but by the compassion and quiet leadership I chose to exhibit, proving that Elias Vance had, in his final, dramatic act, chosen the right heir after all.